A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, Part 7. The scene, if I may ask you to follow me, was now changed. The leaves were still falling, but in London now, not Oxbridge. And I must ask you to imagine a room, like many thousands, with a window looking across people's hats, and vans and motor cars to other windows. And on the table inside the room, a blank sheet of paper on which was written in large letters, Women and Fiction. But no more. The inevitable sequel to lunching and dining at Oxbridge seemed, unfortunately, to be a visit to the British Museum. One must strain off what was personal and accidental in all these impressions, and so reach the pure fluid, the essential oil of truth. For that visit to Oxbridge and the luncheon and the dinner had started a swarm of questions. Why did men drink wine and women water? Why was one sex so prosperous and the other so poor? What effect has poverty on fiction? What conditions are necessary for the creation of works of art? 1,000 questions at once suggested themselves. But one needed answers, not questions. And an answer was only to be had by consulting the learned and the unprejudiced, who have removed themselves above the strife of tongue and the confusion of body, and issued the result of their reasoning and research in books which are to be found in the British Museum. If truth is not to be found on the shelves of the British Museum, where, I ask myself, picking up a notebook and a pencil, is truth? Thus provided, thus confident and inquiring, I set out in the pursuit of truth. The day, though not actually wet, was dismal, and the streets in the neighbourhood of the museum were full of open coal holes, down with sacks where showering, four-wheeled cabs were drawing up and depositing on the pavement corded boxes containing presumably the entire wardrobe of some Swiss or Italian family seeking fortune or refuge or some other desirable commodity which is to be found in the boarding houses of Bloomsbury in the winter. The usual hoarse-voiced men paraded the streets with plants on barrows. Some shouted, others sang. London was like a workshop, London was like a machine. We were all being shot backwards and forwards on this plain foundation to make some pattern. The British Museum was another department of the factory. The swing doors swung open, and there one stood under the vast dome, as if one were a thought in the huge bald forehead which is so splendidly encircled by a band of famous names. One went to the counter, one took a slip of paper, one opened a volume of the catalogue, and the 5 dots were indicated. 5 separate minutes of stupefaction, wonder, and bewilderment. Have you any notion of how many books are written about women in the course of 1 year? Are you aware that you are perhaps the most discussed animal in the universe? Here, had I come with a notebook and a pencil, proposing to spend a morning reading, supposing that at the end of the morning I should have transferred the truth to my notebook. But I should need to be a herd of elephants, I thought, and a wilderness of spiders, desperately referring to the animals that are reputed longest lived and most multitudinously eyed to cope with all this. I should need claws of steel and a beak of brass even to penetrate the husk. How shall I ever find the grains of truth embedded in all this mass of paper? I asked myself, and in despair began running my eye up and down the long list of titles. Even the names of the books gave me food for thought. Sex and its nature might well attract doctors and biologists. But what was surprising and difficult of explanation was the fact that sex, woman, that is to say, also attracts agreeable essayists, light-fingered novelists, young men who have taken the MA degree, men who have taken no degree, men who have no apparent qualification save that they are not women. Some of these books were, on the face of it, frivolous and facetious, but many, on the other hand, were serious and prophetic, moral and hortatory. Merely to read the titles suggested innumerable schoolmasters, innumerable clergymen mounting their platforms and pulpits, and holding forth with loquacity which far exceeded the hour usually allotted to such discourse on this one subject. It was a most strange phenomenon, and apparently here I consulted the letter M, one confined to the male sex. Women do not write books about men, a fact that I could not help welcoming with relief. For if I had first to read all that men have written about women, then all that women have written about men, the aloe that flowers once in 100 years would flower twice before I could set pen to paper. So, making a perfectly arbitrary choice of a dozen volumes or so, I sent my slips of paper to lie in the wire tray and waited in my stall among the other seekers for the essential oil of truth. What could be the reason, then, of this curious disparity, I wondered, drawing cartwheels on the slips of paper provided by the British taxpayer for other purposes? Why are women, judging from this catalogue, so much more interesting to men than men are to women? A very curious fact it seemed, and my mind wandered to picture the lives of men who spend their time in writing books about women. Whether they were old or young, married or unmarried, red-nosed or hump-backed, anyhow, it was flattering vaguely to feel oneself the object of such attention, provided that it was not entirely bestowed by the crippled and the infirm. So I pondered until all such frivolous thoughts were ended by an avalanche of books sliding down onto the desk in front of me. Now the trouble began. The student who has been trained in research at Oxbridge has no doubt some method of shepherding his question past all distractions till it runs into his answers as a sheep runs into its pen. The student by my side, for instance, who was copying assiduously from a scientific manual was, I felt sure, extracting pure nuggets of the essential ore every 10 minutes or so. His little grunts of satisfaction indicated so much. But if, unfortunately, one has no training in the university, the question, far from being shepherded to its pen, flies like a frightened flock hither and thither, helter-skelter, pursued by a whole pack of hounds. Professors, schoolmasters, sociologists, clergymen, novelists, essayists, journalists, men who had no qualifications save that they were not women, chased my simple and single question: why are some women poor? Until it became 50 questions, until the 50 questions leapt frantically into midstream and were carried away. Every page in my notebook was scribbled over with notes to show the state of mind I was in. I will read you a few of them, explaining that the page was headed quite simply Women and Poverty in block letters, but what followed was something like this. End of part 7.